I don't envy the team at Capcom who had to follow up Resident Evil. The original wasn't just a hit, it was a generation-defining work. Following up a project that ambitious is always a challenge, and development on Resident Evil 2 began barely a month after the first game's release. Given RE1's massive success, Capcom executives expected the sequel to sell at least 2 million copies. The pressure was intense. Shinji Mikami, Hideki Kamiya, and the rest of the team knew expectations were sky high. The initial plan seemed straightforward. Take what worked in Resident Evil and expand it. The story would take place 2 months later, with the T-virus outbreak spreading from the Spencer Mansion to Raccoon City itself. Like before, there would be 2 playable characters with branching campaigns and multiple endings, but this time set in a police station rather than a gothic mansion. Capcom hyped up new features, too. Larger groups of enemies would swarm players at once, armor and equipment would appear visibly on character models, and clothing would degrade as damage piled up. On paper, it sounded like a bold, evolutionary step forward. Originally slated for March 1997, RE2's release was delayed nearly a full year to January 1998. The reason? The game just wasn't coming together. According to Mikami, quote, "No one element was specifically boring, just everything as a whole." The script, mostly written by Kamiya himself, lacked polish and had little connection to the first game. The police station setting looked drab compared to the Spencer Mansion. Lower polygon counts allowed for larger enemy groups, but the models themselves looked less frightening. All the team's ideas, so interesting on their own, somehow added up to less than the sum of their parts. Mikami dubbed this version Resident Evil 1.5. He admitted it wasn't bad. In fact, he described it as comparable to other common games of the time. But when the goal is to create something unique and revolutionary, being vanilla wasn't acceptable. Fine wasn't good enough. Not for Resident Evil. This game needed to be something more. So, in early 1997, with the game nearly 80% complete and just months from release, Capcom did the unthinkable. They scrapped almost everything and started over. One of the turning points came with the arrival of screenwriter Noboru Sugimura, at the time perhaps best known for his work on Super Sentai. Originally hired to simply polish Kamiya's script, Sugimura ended up rewriting the entire story from the ground up. His version kept the idea of a citywide outbreak and a police station setting, but gave the narrative stronger ties to the original game. Leon Kennedy remained the male lead, but Elza Walker was replaced with Claire Redfield, Chris's sister, providing a direct link to RE1. Supporting characters were reshaped too. Sherry Birkin and Ada Wong were expanded, while others like Robert Kendo and Marvin Branagh had their roles reduced. Even the police station itself was transformed. Instead of a somewhat unremarkable contemporary office building, the RPD was redesigned into something bizarrely ornate that made exploration more interesting and memorable. This reset gave the team the focus they needed. With Sugimura's tighter script and more compelling environments, RE2 began to resemble the sequel people had been hoping for. Mechanically, RE2 sticks close to RE1's formula. Tank controls, 3D characters on 2D pre-rendered backgrounds, and a mix of exploration, puzzle solving, and survival resource management. But the refinements matter. Your characters are still skating along flat, green-screeny backdrops, but animations are more dynamic and fluid, giving movement a real sense of weight that makes your actions feel more tangible. Characters limp or clutch their wounds depending on their current health, and while there's still no quick turn, auto-aim can now be toggled in the menu. These details make movement feel more grounded and subtly influence how players manage healing. In RE1, I tended to wait to heal at the last possible moment. In RE2, the limp system often pushed me to use up smaller herbs to patch up sooner, just to stay as spry and mobile as possible. Not to mention, having the character's body language reflect their current state means you no longer need to open up the menu after each hit to keep tabs on your condition. UI and item management both received some small but meaningful upgrades, even if nothing here is revolutionary compared to the first game. Instead of the 6 or 8 slots you had depending on character choice in RE1, both Leon and Claire begin with 8 and can expand to 10 roughly halfway through. Heavier weapons like the rocket launcher or flamethrower now take up 2 slots, adding a little more strategic weight to the use of heavy weaponry. The inventory items themselves are 2D images rather than fully rotatable models, though that feature in the first game was more gimmick than necessity, so its absence here isn't much of a loss. A few frustrations from RE1 have also been ironed out. Text scrolls faster, grenade rounds can be swapped freely once loaded, and the grenade launcher also has no limit on the amount of rounds that can be loaded at once. Storage boxes are smarter too, automatically combining stacks of ammo if you place them in the same slot, which saves time compared to manually stacking. You still can't skip in-engine cutscenes, but since the A-B scenario system makes story paths more distinct this time, you're much less likely to be stuck rewatching the exact same scenes anyway. Unlockables also see improvements, as infinite weapons carry over across save files, and the secret locker outfits are tied to a fun Easter egg for fans of the first game. It feels more rewarding than RE1's somewhat arbitrary closet key. Enemy variety also got a huge upgrade. The zombies in the first game basically came in two varieties, guy in white jacket and guy in green jacket. Now zombies come in varied genders, outfits, and body types, including former police officers. They even have some new tricks up their tattered sleeves, such as crawling after you if dismembered or lunging at your ankles. Classic foes like zombie dogs, spiders, and crows return, joined by new monsters. Ivy zombies, a giant moth, and the unforgettable lickers, grotesque brain-exposed predators with whip-like tongues, which essentially act as this game's version of hunters. The lickers are a perfect mix of terrifying and tactical, since they're easily capable of draining your health in a matter of seconds, but are also completely blind and can be avoided with careful movement, as long as you keep your nerve. Bosses, though, unfortunately remain underwhelming in design. The strategy is still shoot until it falls and move if it gets close. One fight cleverly uses the environment for a quick kill, but most are pushovers if you've got the right weapon. The first boss will likely die before he even gets close enough to do anything. That said, the bosses do benefit from great monster design, and the soundtrack does a lot to make the encounters feel more dramatic than they are mechanically. Visually, RE2's backgrounds are far richer and more dynamic than RE1's emptier rooms. Compared to the often empty or under-designed rooms of the Spencer Mansion, the various locales in RE2 feel simultaneously alive and appropriately devastated in the wake of the zombie infestation. Part of what makes classic Resident Evil so charming to me is how it's supposed to be set in America, but it's very obviously America as imagined from Japan. There's this funny disconnect running through the whole thing. Like, Sherry shows up in a school uniform, even though basically no American school requires one, and definitely not one that looks like that. And don't even get me started on Raccoon City's downtown layout. No US city planner in the last 150 years has ever made streets this compact or walkable. CG cutscenes replace the original's live-action camp, and sound design hits a new level. The raspy breathing and aggressive screeches of the lickers are iconic horror audio. The soundtrack takes a more cinematic, Hollywood-inspired approach, layering dread during exploration and going big during boss fights and set pieces. Right from the opening chaos in Raccoon City's zombie-filled streets, you hear this loud, tense leitmotif, a simple 3-note sequence that keeps cropping up in different ways throughout the game's areas and cutscenes. But voice acting made perhaps the biggest step forward. Although the scripts were written in Japanese, evident in funny gaffes like Mugnum parts, Emergency Dale, and Reach to the Police Station, classic Resident Evil games deliberately used only English voices in all regions. Unlike RE1's infamous performances, RE2 used actual American and Canadian actors, and the cutscenes were animated around their deliveries rather than the other way around. The result is still cheesy, but far more professional.
And to think that taxidermy used to be my hobby.
Fans had actually asked Capcom to keep the B-movie camp from the first game, and in some ways RE2 split the difference. Better acting, but still leaning into corniness. Not by accident, but as part of the aesthetic.
Guy's a maniac. Why'd he bite me?
Still, the voice acting wasn't exactly spared from criticism. Even in 1998, most players would have called it mediocre at best, and later that year, Metal Gear Solid raised the bar with what was arguably the most professional-sounding English voice cast in a video game that wasn't made by LucasArts. Honestly, I'd even give Mega Man Legends the edge over RE2. Sure, it sounded a little childish at times, but the performances had more energy overall. Still, a few of RE2's actors stuck around long enough to become franchise fixtures. While most Resident Evil games shuffled their casts like a deck of cards, Claire and Ada's actresses, Allison Court and Sally Cahill, bucked the trend. Court, in particular, went on to voice Claire in nearly every official appearance of the character up until 2013. In Resident Evil terms, that may as well be a Lifetime Achievement Award.
You lose, big guy.
The story is where Resident Evil 2 makes its most dramatic break from the original structure. Instead of branching paths and choose-your-own-adventure progression, RE2 presents 2 alternative plots split across 4 mostly linear campaigns. In contrast to the scrapped 1.5 build, where Leon and Elza never crossed paths, the final game has Leon and Claire intersecting regularly, with the direction of the story depending on which character you play first. The game ships on 2 discs, one for Leon, one for Claire, and each has both an A and B scenario that link together to form one complete story. Claire A runs parallel to Leon B, while Leon A runs parallel to Claire B. Finishing an A scenario lets you load that save file as the other character and see what they were doing the whole time. Choices once planned to be determined by the player's specific actions, like Sherry's infection or Ada's fate, are now determined entirely by scenario order. The B scenarios also add exclusive areas and events and allow you to see the game's true ending. Where RE1 presented 2 contradictory but equally plausible timelines, each with several possible branches, RE2 instead ties its story routes together as 2 interlocking halves of a single overarching narrative. It feels like a natural evolution of the first game's storytelling. The player still chooses which storyline to follow and which they ultimately prefer, and even Capcom has waffled a bit over which pairing counts as canon, but now the 2 protagonists are no longer completely isolated from one another, creating a stronger sense of cohesion between their stories. To offset the story's more linear structure, the team introduced a system they called Zapping, reportedly inspired by Back to the Future Part 2. The idea was that choices made in one character's A scenario would carry over into the corresponding B scenario, creating long-term consequences. For example, a certain locker contains both a powerful weapon and a side pack that grants additional item slots, but whatever items the first character takes will be gone for the second. Likewise, the way one character defeats a boss determines whether the other has to face it later. In practice, though, zapping feels underused. Ammo and healing items are there for both characters regardless, and puzzles are oh so conveniently reset. Still, it adds replay value and a few memorable moments of player choice to an otherwise straightforward story. Narratively, RE2 broadens the scale. Instead of a largely isolated conspiracy in a remote mansion, this is a desperate citywide collapse. Leon and Claire aren't elite soldiers, but ordinary people, a rookie cop and a college student, trapped in a nightmare far beyond their depth. The story trades the gradual creeping dread of RE1 for a louder, faster-paced sense of chaos, desperation, and escalation, and it works very well. When it comes to how Leon and Claire actually play, Resident Evil 2 takes a simpler, more balanced approach than the first game. Both characters share the same health and inventory capacity, so the main differences come down to weapons and equipment. In RE1, Jill was the easy option and Chris the hard one, but here the 2 are more evenly matched, each with their own pros and cons. This makes replaying both characters feel less like 2 difficulty levels and more like 2 distinct playstyles. Claire, much like Jill before her, gets the grenade launcher. Its 3 ammo types make her kit more versatile by letting her exploit weaknesses. Fire rounds are great against IV zombies, acid melts through liquors, and so on. Her other unique weapons are a mixed bag. The bowgun, which feels like a halfway point between a handgun and a shotgun, and the spark shot, a glorified taser that looks neat but never feels particularly useful. She also carries a lockpick, though this is less valuable than it was in RE1. You'll still need to collect door keys for progression, and the locked desks it opens usually just cough up some basic ammo or first aid. Leon, by contrast, sticks to a straightforward arsenal of handgun, shotgun, and magnum, as well as the flamethrower. The flamethrower is now a permanent pickup rather than a one-off puzzle item, and his 3 main firearms can each be upgraded with parts to boost power and ammo capacity, giving him a gradual edge as the campaign goes on. Instead of a lockpick, Leon gets the lighter as a permanent tool, an upgrade over Chris's situation in the first game where the lighter was just another item eating up inventory space. In short, Leon's loadout is more traditional but scales well with upgrades, while Claire's is more tactical, rewarding players who like exploiting enemy weaknesses. The balance feels much fairer than the easy mode versus hard mode split of RE1, especially since both characters also have potential access to the submachine gun and side pack, with the zapping system letting players decide who gets which. And because the characters themselves no longer serve as difficulty settings, RE2 adds an actual difficulty selection at the start of the game. Easy mode dumps a mountain of ammo and healing items into your lap and even buffs character health, but there's a catch. Finish the game on easy and you won't get ranked. Ranking in RE2 saw a big overhaul from the first game. Where RE1 judged you solely on completion time, RE2 uses an invisible point system that factors in not just speed, but also how many first aid sprays you burn through and how many times you saved. At the end, you're graded from A to D, and your rank determines which infinite weapons and bonus modes you unlock. The infinite rocket launcher returns, joined this time by an infinite submachine gun and a Gatling gun, the latter earned only by finishing a B scenario without saving. The real prize, though, is unlocked by clearing a B scenario with an A rank, the fourth survivor. This short but canonical side mode follows Umbrella operative Hunk as he tries to escape Raccoon City with a G-Virus sample, surviving gauntlets of enemies with limited ammo and healing items. It's essentially the successor to the battle game from RE1's Saturn port, an arcade-style sprint meant to test skill and resource management. Unlike later ports, the original PS1 release didn't time or rank you in Fourth Survivor, making it a pure challenge mode with no strings attached. Play through the campaigns enough times and you'll also unlock Tofu Survivor, a full-on joke mode that became a cult classic. Here you play as a giant sentient block of tofu, originally a placeholder model used during development to test hitboxes, armed only with a knife. The twist is that Tofu has absurdly high health and never limps, so you don't suffer the usual speed penalty. What started as a silly developer in-joke ended up one of the most famous Easter eggs in survival horror. Those bonus modes really represent the peak challenge RE2 has to offer. Despite all of its refinements, the main campaigns of RE2 are arguably the easiest of the classic Resident Evil titles. Ammo and herbs are abundant, almost overwhelmingly so, and even first-time players will likely have plenty of spare resources by the time they reach the final stretch. That said, the opening segment through the zombie-infested Raccoon City streets can be brutal, with 10 to 15 minutes of constant enemy encounters and potential game overs before reaching even the first save point. These early screens serve as a sort of crash course in ammo conservation and enemy evasion, but once you're past them, the game rarely feels as punishing ever again. This likely reflects RE2's lean toward action, whereas RE1 emphasized exploration and puzzles, with zombies primarily as tension devices. RE2 isn't shy about overwhelming the player with large groups of enemies, even early on. In RE1, seeing more than 2 zombies in the same room was a rarity, but you don't even need to get 2 rooms into RE2's police station before finding swarms of them. To balance this, the game compensates with generous item placement. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that even newcomers could achieve a B ranking their first time through without even really trying. The B scenarios attempt to increase challenge, at least at first. Since they only unlock after beating a character's A scenario, the developers shuffled puzzles and key item locations and introduced more dangerous enemies earlier. The B scenarios also feature a recurring exclusive enemy, a new type of tyrant, nicknamed Mr. X in some licensed materials, though never actually called that in the game. He periodically blocks the player's path, forcing either retreat or combat. In truth, the tyrant's appearances are completely scripted. Once the illusion is broken, so to speak, the guy becomes an absolute joke. He disappears as soon as you leave the room, and pumping a few shotgun or acid rounds into him will down him and reward you with ammo packs. Still, his appearances are placed close enough together that without a walkthrough, first-time players may genuinely feel like they're being stalked. Perhaps more importantly, Mr. X laid the groundwork for more dynamic stalker-type enemies down the line, such as Nemesis, Lady Dimitrescu, and even Mr. X's own expanded role in the RE2 remake. Lady Dimitrescu? Lady Dimitrescu? Lady Dimitrescu. Outside of difficulty, RE2 also shows some pacing quirks. The RPD and its basement dominate roughly 60% of the game, easily longer than every other area of the game combined, and so later areas feel less meticulously designed. Raccoon City and its conspicuously art museum-esque police station feature layered backtracking, key hunting, and puzzles reminiscent of RE1, but the sewers and abandoned factory are essentially a bunch of cramped hallways. And if you ask me, they feel like little more than ammo dumps designed to thin your supply down before the final stretch. The massive Umbrella labs are striking at first, but the climactic self-destruct timer kicks in almost immediately, cutting short the tension just as it was starting to get good. Puzzles outside the station are similarly simplified. In at least one instance, the item needed to progress is placed immediately next to where it needs to be used, reducing challenge almost to the point of humor. This design likely reflects the game's late-stage restart. The team probably didn't have time to fully flesh out later areas or fine-tune difficulty, so they erred on the side of generosity. While it's true that the mansion in RE1 was also where most of your time was spent, it was also explored over 2 distinct visits, with the guardhouse acting as an extended intermission, and the second trip introduced stronger enemies that forced players to rethink familiar routes. By contrast, RE2's police station is far less dynamic. Once an enemy is defeated, that room stays completely clear for the rest of the game, removing any need to revisit strategies or adapt to renewed threats. Exploration is far less rewarding in the second half of the game, and the game's linearity is more pronounced. Another side effect of this is that boss encounters are all backloaded. Each major area, the station, sewers, factory, and labs, has one key boss. But since the RPD is so extensive, the first boss doesn't appear until you're just past the game's halfway point. And given that every subsequent area is significantly smaller, you're practically bombarded with fight after fight from then on, making the game's entire second half feel rushed. RE1 has almost the exact same number of bosses as RE2, but there they felt more evenly spaced apart. Overall, RE2's level design is a study in contrast. The RPD is a slow burn of rising tension, while the later areas feel like a breakneck sprint. Despite these issues, though, RE2 consistently delivers excitement. The first game may have stronger atmospheric moments, but RE2's best set pieces surpass anything in RE1. The stakes continually escalate as you uncover Umbrella's darker deeds, and certain recurring enemies refuse to stay down, lending a sense of persistent danger. Whereas RE1 felt more grounded, at least as grounded as a zombie sci-fi story can be, RE2 felt like an event, a larger, relentless, and more cinematic survival horror experience. And what an impact it had. Even prior to release, Resident Evil 2 was one of the most anticipated game releases of its day, and Capcom poured a ton of money into its marketing, so much so that they hired George Romero to direct the TV commercials. Once the game was finally out, RE2 became the fastest-selling game in North America, breaking records previously held by Final Fantasy VII and Super Mario 64. Within a month and a half, it had sold over 3 million copies, and by the end of 1998, nearly 5 million. To this day, the most copies any Resident Evil game has ever sold on a single console. Resident Evil 2 was one of 1998's most critically acclaimed games, and remains widely regarded as one of the greatest sequels and survival horror games ever made. Everything that worked in the first game was expanded or improved, with higher stakes and more spectacle, all while keeping the original game's core appeal intact. That said, some criticisms were unavoidable. People grumbled about the controls, tank controls of course, which in hindsight is a bit funny. Nowadays we tend to blame those darn kids for criticizing the old control schemes, but in actuality complaints about classic RE tank controls date back to literally the second game. The acting and writing were often called cheesy, and the zapping system, while clever on paper, felt underutilized in practice. Still, for many players, the game's design, pacing, and replay value more than made up for its quirks. Despite the near-universal praise, RE2 didn't exactly sweep the awards circuit, but if we're being honest, that's because the competition that year was absolutely insane. It was nominated for Best Action-Adventure Game and Best PlayStation Game, but lost both times to Metal Gear Solid. It was even nominated for Game of the Year, but that ended up going to Ocarina of Time. Much as I love RE2, I can't complain about those outcomes. Those are all fantastic games. Over time, RE2 has only grown in stature, often placed alongside classics like GoldenEye and Final Fantasy VII as some of the most influential games of their generation, and it eventually earned the number 4 spot on Famitsu's list of best PlayStation games of all time. Resident Evil 2 is one of those rare big-budget sequels that didn't sacrifice creative integrity or quality control just for the sake of meeting a deadline. They made sure the game was given as much time to cook as it needed. And yet, fans still never forgot about the lost Resident Evil 1.5. Capcom was unusually transparent about the scrapped version in the lead up to RE2, and over the years, leaked builds, assets, and story drafts turned it into one of gaming's most famous what-ifs. From what we've seen, RE 1.5 probably would have been a decent game, but Capcom wasn't aiming for decent. They needed something incredible. And that's exactly what Resident Evil 2 turned out to be.